Hello, my guest today is Matt Zemon. Matt is the CEO and co-founder of Happy, a mental wellness company that specializes in psychedelic-assisted ketamine therapy along with digital therapeutics that promote life-transforming outcomes. He's the author of the new book, Psychedelics for Everyone, a beginner's guide to these powerful medicines for anxiety, depression, addiction, PSTD, and expanding consciousness. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm really excited to get in here and dig into this topic today of psychedelics for everyone and why that might be the case. But let's back up a little bit. And why don't you tell us some of your story leading up to how you got interested in this subject of psychedelics?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I grew up in the 80s. So I grew up much like you did with the just say no, the frying pan with the eggs on it. And I was taught that drugs are bad. I was never really a drug user, not even a big drinker. And about 3 years ago, I had a chance to do a guided psilocybin experience. And in that experience, again, very unusual for me, in that experience, I reconnected with my mom who died right after I graduated college. And it was just such an incredible experience to be able to kind of pull a string from her to me to my kids and reconnect in a way that in my wildest imagination, I couldn't have expected. And I wanted to learn more. And from that point, I've kind of altered my life to be deep diving into the world of psychedelics, consciousness. I went and got a Master of Science in Psychology and Neuroscience of Mental Health and really diving deep into the subject.
Okay, so I think that most of my listeners can appreciate that we're all going to be 50 or older. Most of us are, right? And so most of us lived through the 80s, and we do remember those commercials with the egg in the frying pan. If you're not familiar, somebody cracks up, says, "This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?" And of course, there's nothing but questions after watching that. But the idea was drugs are bad, right? And drugs are this catch-all for anything that I guess some government agency has deemed to be a illegal substance. So before we start diving into psychedelics and their use therapeutically, you mentioned that you weren't a drug user, you weren't even really a drinker, and you just kind of stumbled. Did you stumble into this? How were you first introduced to
So,
this topic? Right? How did you
yeah,
go from being, that kid who's, hey, I'm just saying no, to somebody who's willing to experiment?
yeah, I had some really good friends who had organized a guide experience. So they said, look, this is, if you're going to ever try this is the way to do it. This person's a professional and you're in good hands, and it would be a good experiment. And I thought, I like to travel, and this sounds like a bit of a journey, and I like learning, and this sounds like a learning experience, and it sounds like I'll be safe in doing this, so why not? Let's go ahead and try it. But I went in with really low expectations, and it just so radically exceeded anything I could have imagined. Have you had any experience with psychedelics?
I have. I've actually had fairly extensive experience with psychedelics, and it would have started in my teen years, and certainly really exploring through my 20s and in the college era. And like you, I found it to be very, very profound. Now, I was familiar with, unfortunately, a lot of drugs and a lot of alcohol. I had some issues struggling with that, and when I found kind of the psychedelic group of drugs, to your point, it was this mind expansion, this, I guess, consciousness shift, which we're going to get into all of that, right? Because there are going to be two types of people listening to this: those that have that experience and those that don't have it and are probably curious. But yes, I don't remember how I originally got involved in this, but I would have been in circles where that would have been an option. And eventually I took it, and in my own journey, it was more of a recreational thing to begin with. And I quickly found that there was something different, something special about this experience. And that was more of a spiritual journey for me from that point forward. I would take it very purposefully, as opposed to, hey, I'm just escaping from whatever it is I was running away from right at the time. So in your own experience, then, you went from, as opposed to having a lot of experience with illegal drugs, you you were willing to try this, which seems like a strange place to on ramp into drug use, into illegal drug use. But yeah, talk to us a little bit about that first experience. What was that like for you in terms of, you had mentioned just consciousness expanding?
Yeah, I mean, so picture 6, 7 of us with a guide, and the guide had asked us all to bring something memorable from our childhood to put on this altar. So we all brought something, and we took some time to tell everybody what that thing was. And then we meditated for a little bit, gave thanks to the medicine, consumed the medicine, and then kind of meditated and just let it kind of slowly come on. And then for about 6, 7 hours, we each were on our own journeys. For me, some of the big pieces was again the reconnection with my mom, realizing that I was scared of death. My dad had actually died 2 years before my mom, so I was a junior in college, and here I was, I guess, 47 years old, and realizing that, oh my gosh, I've lived my whole life afraid of dying. And all of a sudden, in that instant, I realized I'm not afraid. I'm carrying them forward. My children are carrying me forward. There's nothing. I'm safe. I'm loved. What a great place to be. And that was really profound for me. So I the scale on which the emotions were something I just hadn't experienced. I knew kind of what the low point of my register was, but I didn't know what the high point was. And I could really feel a different level of safety and love that I just never experienced before. And it was just beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Now, you referred to that as medicine, and obviously you came into this in a very structured environment, and we're going to get to
Mm-hmm.
different ways of using this, especially when it comes to therapeutic uses. But so it sounds like you had a structure to this, that this wasn't a recreation. This wasn't somebody saying, "Hey, let's trip." This was, "Hey, let's have this experience together with intention," right? And you had a guided mentor. Now, you had mentioned medicine a couple of times. When you say medicine, what are you talking about there?
In this case, I'm talking about psilocybin, or more commonly known as magic mushrooms. And you are right. What all the research kind of talks about is set and setting. So what is your mindset going into a psychedelic experience? What is the intentionality you're bringing to it? And then what is the setting? What's the environment like? What are the people you're with? And do you feel safe and secure and comfortable in where you are? And if you can get those two things right, the probability of having a challenging trip is radically reduced.
Right. So if you can get the set, meaning mindset and the setting, your environment, your physical, as well as, I suppose, emotional and social environment correct, you're much less likely to have a bad trip, which people may have heard of, or may even know people that have had bad. When we say a bad trip, we're talking about basically a bad psychological experience. So before we go down that rabbit hole, because I want to come back and pull that apart a little bit, but let's talk about let's put a container or a wrapper around this. When we say psychedelics, what are we talking about? Let's define that.
Yeah, so these are really any of the medicines that can lead to a either hallucinatory or dissociative or a mystic state type of experience. So what have your listeners heard of? They've probably heard of LSD or acid, magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, ketamine, ibogaine. Those are all types of psychedelic medicines, but there are hundreds of them. Just most of us don't know the more or less recognized names. And then ketamine would be the only one that is legal in the United States.
Yeah, and again, I want to come back to that as well, to the legality issue.
Mm-hmm.
But backing up a little bit, let's talk a little bit about the history of psychedelics, because these medicines basically have been in use in cultures for basically as long as there's been mankind. Is that fair?
Absolutely. I mean, there's cave drawings, thousands of years old of psychedelic mushrooms. There's research on psychedelic use in really every culture around the world. This is not just a Central or South American experience. It's everywhere. And it was only with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 that they became illegal here in the United States. And that was a huge shift in the ability to have access to these transformational medicines. And that came well after thousands upon thousands of papers were done showing that these have medical use. So there were really it was not very sound logic for making them illegal.
Yeah, and I'd like to speculate a little bit here because, of course, the powers that be stepped in and made that a schedule, whatever the bad schedule is, right?
Schedule 1.
The schedule, yeah. And in fact, if you got caught with LSD or any of these other psychoactive substances, you could be in pretty serious trouble, including jail time, right? I mean, they were very, very seriously in shutting this down, but yet there was a lot of promising research before that. Right now, there was some crazy research as well. I think the armed forces are always going to be exploring whatever they can. And of course, their experiments likely went on, but for the most part, the universities that were studying this in clinical settings, all that was shut down, right? And why do you think that was? What was so scary about this substance or these substances, this class of drugs, that caused such a panic to lock it down like that?
Yeah, I think we had a couple of things converging. We had the Nixon administration not liking what the quote hippies were doing, protesting the idea of war, not wanting to participate in those types of activities. And then we had the civil rights movement continuing in the African American communities. So by banning drugs, that was a way for them to actually infiltrate both of those groups and start making change. And I think that was probably the primary driver for making these illegal. It certainly wasn't because they hadn't been shown to have any medical use. And it certainly wasn't because they had been shown to be more harmful than other things that already were legal, such as tobacco and alcohol.
Yeah, so this is probably a good time then to bring this up, because when we look at the safety record of, say, tobacco, alcohol, now, of course, marijuana, THC, which is becoming legalized in many states, we see that there tends to be a lot more danger to oneself and to others with some of these other drugs, these commonly accepted drugs like alcohol, than there is these hallucinogenic drugs. And how safe are these drugs?
That's a interesting question.
Bit of a loaded question there.
Yeah, a little bit. But I mean, so you're there's a study that you're referring to, which is the harm to yourself or harm to others, and there's a graph. And on the left-hand side of the graph, you see things like alcohol, which is just not healthy.
It's up there with heroin, right?
It's awful. Yeah, it's very challenging. And then the far right-hand side of that graph, you have mushrooms, which really don't have any negative effects on the person or the society as a whole. And in between, you have different levels of safety. So each medicine has its own safety profile. I'm going to use ibogaine as an example. It's a much more dangerous psychedelic, but it's really used for people who have strong opioid or heroin addictions, and it's a medicine of kind of last resort. Things like mushrooms, ayahuasca, LSD, much, much, much safer.
So when these things are safe, and we're going to get into their efficacy for treatments. But what you had mentioned that ketamine is the only drug that's in this class that's legal now. What are the laws? And is that a state by state? What are the laws looking like today? And where do you see these laws going?
Sure. So ketamine is FDA approved as an anesthetic, and it has been since like 1970. 20,000 plus papers on its safety. It is used off-label for mental health and has been since 1974. So nationwide, any prescriber is allowed to prescribe ketamine for depression and anxiety. It's a generic medication, and there's just different ways that you can actually take the ketamine, but completely legal nationwide. Where the law's going? Well, right now, MDMA is kind of the most exciting one on the horizon, which I didn't mention earlier. MDMA is being tested in phase 3, part 2 trials right now with people who have treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So a lot of veterans, a lot of victims of sexual assault. What they're finding is for people who have, again, treatment resistant, nothing else has worked, 2 MDMA sessions, 67% no longer have PTSD. It is such a high number, it's almost unfathomable. So it appears that the FDA is about to approve that to be legalized within the next year or two on the outside.
Wow. Okay. So when we say MDMA, that's ecstasy, right? Is that the
It is.
street name?
Yeah, that was the street
Now,
name.
and I remember reading a study, and this was a long time ago, but they went out and I guess researchers collected a bunch of street samples of ecstasy. And what they found is, I don't remember that, you may know, but I don't remember the percentage, but I think the vast percentage of what they collected had 0 MDMA in it. In fact, it had all these other ingredients. So when we're talking about the safety of these substances, what about, because they're not regulated and because they're illegal, we're now going through, let's face it, black market channels to get these things. How can one feel safe in getting what, unless you know somebody who happens to be a chemist, and especially MDMA, in my understanding, that's a little complicated to make, but how do we know what we're getting, whether it's a mushroom or a little tab of acid or whatever it is, right?
Sure, you've done your research, so you're right on. That study is more than 50% of things that are sold as MDMA contain zero MDMA.
Yeah.
And then it's only like 20% was pure, and the rest was adulterated with something. So it's pretty terrifying. It's terrifying for, I'm sure your listeners' kids and grandkids, that they're out there, and this is something that can happen. So there's an organization out there called Dance Safe, and they sell test kits. So with teenagers, I recommend buying it and keeping it in the house as a precaution, and let them test their medicine. At a lot of the festivals, encourage their Dance Safe is there, and you can drop one of your, if you have anything on you, with them, and they'll test it and then send out an Instagram saying, hey, the blue Smurfs are not what you think they are. Don't take them. And that's a really great service. But for home use, the test kits, especially with fentanyl today, it's such a dangerous drug. Knowing what you have is very, very important.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one of the challenges that makes this less accessible to people that maybe aren't familiar. I mean, frankly, if you don't know where to go to get, if you're not in a drug culture, or if you don't know people that are already into this, it'd be very scary and intimidating to try and experiment with this, and made even more perilous by the fact that whatever it is you're buying may or may not be what you expect it is. All right, so
it's let me just jump in there for a second. It's
sure.
super frustrating that we just can't have a reasonable discussion on drugs in this country. It's just not allowed to. It's just prohibited. End of story. But that is where ketamine is so powerful, that people can do that and ask for it and get it.
And ketamine's being offered in that therapeutic sense that you're talking about. I know locally they've got some ketamine folks that are advertising to end-of-life folks, depression, things like that, right? That you can have these controlled ketamine, kind of like you described your first experience with mushrooms, where you come in, and it's a therapy session, and it's ketamine enhanced. Okay, so we were talking about the conversation can't be had, and why is this so taboo? I mean, because you're right. Of all the things we might discuss, we can discuss cocaine, and we can laugh about cocaine. We can talk about heroin. Oh, yeah, that's not a good one. And Lord knows we celebrate alcohol. Why are these hallucinogenics still so taboo, even to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's two things. I think mental health as a whole is challenging to talk about. People, if I broke my leg, you'd be like, oh, I'm sorry you broke your leg. You would think less of me for having a broken leg. But for some reason, if I'm feeling depressed or have high anxiety, that may be looked at differently. And whether it is or not, and whether it's my perception, it's pretty normal for people to feel that way. On top of that, I think for all of us who are 50 and older, we've had totally drilled into our head by the government, by the media, drugs are bad. And hallucinogenic drugs are bad, and they're going to burn a hole in our brain, and we're going to jump off the roof, and we're going to do bad things on these hallucinogens. and it's just we swim in it. We don't even notice it. But when you look at the research and pause for a second, there's a lot of evidence saying, no, this is just not true.
Yeah, and I kind of have my own thoughts on why maybe some of this discussion is suppressed a little bit, and it's maybe around the results that people get from hallucinogenic experiences, because it's and I'm gonna have a hard time verbalizing this, but when we break down some of our preconceived notions of reality, and by that I mean my otherness as opposed to I'm a part of everything. When we start to have this cosmic shift in our mindset and our belief, we have a different worldview on the other side of these experiences very often. And I don't know that fits the narrative of where I don't think there's an evil cabal of rich old white men wringing their hands going, hey, we got to keep these people off of acid. But I do think that a large population of people thinking for themselves and thinking creatively and in this new consciousness way isn't appealing to maybe some of the big financial institutions perhaps. And I suppose really what's going to make or break the legality of hallucinogenics is whether big pharma can extract whatever it is that's, because they're not going to make money selling mushrooms, right? Because we can grow mushrooms, but if they could extract that psilocybin and then what's the word I'm looking for? To protect it, right?
Sure, or patent it.
Copyright it or whatever, patent it. Thank you. Yeah. Then there's big money to be made there. But it is an interesting time in our history where we're still afraid to have this conversation. And I feel like, again, people at 50 and older, they've had these experiences, maybe are still continuing to, or they haven't. But we're really not talking about it that much, and I think that's it's just culturally interesting to me.
You're totally right. I mean, this big pharma, it's an issue. Even if you patent a synthesized version of a psychedelic, one of the other challenges is you don't take them that often. Maybe you do it once, right, twice in your whole life. Maybe you're onto a more frequent schedule with a ketamine, and you're doing it once a week, once every 2 weeks. But none of this is an everyday drug like an antidepressant. None of this is a prescribe it and forget it like an antidepressant. How many people in this over 50 crowd that we live in have been on antidepressants for 20 some years? And they're dealing with all those side effects, whether it's the lack of sexual libido, to the weight gain, to the cognitive impairments, the stomach issues, the gastrointestinal. There's a lot that we just, again, aren't talking about. 40% of those who are prescribed antidepressants, they don't work on. These are big numbers. There needs to be something else. And to your point, Big Pharma is not incentivized to make it a psychedelic.
Yeah, I hadn't thought through to that point. You're right. I mean, I'm saying nobody had. Most people who are using psychedelic drugs are not using them regularly. Certainly not in the way that Big Pharma would need you to in order to make their money and make their shareholders happy. So, in addition to the fact that it might be tough to actually patent a psychedelic drug, or maybe not so much, you're not going to be able to prescribe that and say, okay, take one every morning. Although we are going to get around to a discussion about microdosing, but I don't think we're there yet.
Okay.
Let's back up a little bit, because your specialty really is kind of this therapeutic use for psychedelics. Like I said, I got into it originally as a recreational escapism kind of thing and found, wow, that's literally mind-blowing, and transitioned more into a spiritual journey, medicine sort of relationship with it. But what are we treating today with psychedelics? Or what let me back up, because really there's only one in the US, but I guess worldwide that may be different. What's available for us to treat with these psychedelic medicines?
Okay, so you've put a lot into that question there. So let me break it into a couple of different pieces. That's fascinating. I mean, what I guess first I'd ask, when we're talking about 50 and older, why is this age group? Why are we turning to psychedelics? Why is Michael Pollan writing about his psychedelic use with his book, How to Change Your Mind, and now the new Netflix series? That's a beautiful place to start for those who are curious, by the way. So what's going on with us over 50? Let's talk about that first and then talk about the technology. So we can say, okay, our kids are gone. That's a change in our life. It's a change in our marriages for a lot of us, and we're having a transition there. A lot of times we're moving. We've been in the same house, and now the kids are gone, and we're going to downsize, and that's a change. Wow. Our bodies are changing. Menopause for a number of us. Retirement is on the horizon, and it's becoming way more real. So there's money issues. With COVID, we saw a spike in alcohol use, so we're now potentially drinking more than we have before. And then there's a loneliness to all of this. There's a change in our friendships that occurs. So there's just a lot of stuff happening, and we have the time and the resources maybe to do something about it. So that's none of that is a diagnosis. None of that's saying, oh, you have depression or you have anxiety or you have trauma that you need to unresolved trauma. This is just the stuff that happens. Is this resonating with you, Kevin? Does this make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you are hitting the nail right on the head for the majority of my audience, right? We are in this time of flux. There are these big life changes, events for us. And yeah, please continue.
So then the question is, so what are we going to do about it? Are we going to continue to live as we are, just continue drinking every night and living with these feelings? Or are we going to try to do something? So then what are your options was the question. What can you do? So option number one would be to say, I want to do something in my town, and I'd like it to be a medical process. All right, go find a ketamine clinic, and we can talk in a moment kind of about the different flavors of ketamine options there are out there, and so because there are radically different ketamine solutions, but that's a very easy option. It's a very easy option. Maybe if you're more adventurous, you could hop on an airplane and go take a psilocybin or an ayahuasca journey in one of the jurisdictions where that's legal, and that's another great way to experience this. And then I guess the third option is if you found your own way to mushrooms or other psychedelic medicine, then looking for an integrator, someone who can help you with the medicine. So you can both set your intentions of what are you doing, but then help you unpack what is it that you just saw and experienced, and how can you incorporate that into your everyday life? How can you make that part of your fitness routine, and how can you make that change your work and your relationship with your kids and your grandkids?
Yeah, so I love that you break that down into three phases there for us, or three options. One is right now you can go find a ketamine clinic, probably somewhere near you, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And make an appointment and do some work there. And I do want to unpack ketamine. I wasn't aware that it had a lot of different options. And then you had mentioned travel. So is there a hallucinogenic psychedelic travel industry now? Where can people go? I'm guessing Central South America.
Absolutely. I mean, you can go to Retreat Guru and search for, I think they call them plant medicine retreats. And if you look at Mexico has a whole bunch, Peru, certainly Costa Rica, the Netherlands, Jamaica. There's a number of options depending on which medicine you want to do. Psilocybin is a kind of a more gentler way to start. Ayahuasca is more challenging, but it's beautiful and very, very deep.
Yeah. Okay. So folks can take a look there. There's some good references and resources, and I will put all of the things that we're talking about, the Dance Safe and the Retreat Guru, and all these links that we're talking about in the show notes here, and folks can check that out afterwards.
Okay. So, I'll just add, and I don't want to make this at all about plugging my book, but I there is a chapter specifically on how to find a Central or South American retreat and even what to pack. That's in that book. So if people want to go find psychedelics for everyone, that's a specific chapter they might be interested in.
Absolutely. And I'll certainly put a link to the book in here as well in the show notes. So those of us that are thinking, okay, I tuned into this episode, probably because I've done psychedelics and it sounds like a fun conversation, or because I'm curious, right? And so maybe they came in with some trepidation. They're listening to you speak and they're thinking, okay, I'm a little less terrified of psychedelics now, but kind of walk us through, if somebody were to book a trip to, say, one of these locations and do a psilocybin medicine session, what might that look like, and what might a traveler there expect?
Okay. Typically, on those experiences, you're looking at between 3 and 7 days. Um, so you're going to go down there. They're typically they're nice for the most part. There's something for every budget, but they're nice. You're going to go down there. There's going to be like-minded people. What the questions that I would ask though is like, how many people are going to be in this experience with you? That ranges radically. There are organizations out there that will have 80 people, 100 people at a time doing ayahuasca. Personally, that seems like a lot to me. There are other organizations where it's 20, 30, and still others that are 10 or 12. So that is it's a personal decision, but something that is definitely worth asking about. Most of these, you're going to have 2 or 3 different medicine ceremonies during the course of a week, let's say. So it's you're going down there and there's some preparation time. Why are you here? What are you thinking about? What are the things that you're bringing to this experience? Then maybe a medicine experience. And then what did you see? Unpacking, not really offering advice, but more just asking you questions. What did you see? What did that mean? How did that go? How did that feel? And then do it again, and then do it a third time. And then the good retreat centers have some type of integration after you go back home. So whether it's a group integration call or some type of ongoing support for you as things continue to unpack themselves over the weeks and months following the experience.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I think that that's really important, that because this is a profound experience. So if people are trying to understand what it's like, it's one of the most profound experiences you will ever experience. And while you could miss the opportunity by just having that experience and thinking, wow, and then going on about your regular life, right? And it having no real meaningful, lasting impact on your life. Or you could say, now, wait a minute, I feel like I've made, there was this deep shift inside of me. I feel like I am now a different person with a different perspective on things. And then how would you, like you said, reintegrate that? And how would that change your life? What would change for you? And how would you carry that into your life moving forward? I believe would be a really important step that I hadn't really thought of, but certainly would bring a lot of value to that experience, as opposed to it just being a psychedelic drug experience, that this being more of a life therapy experience. Is that fair?
Absolutely. So it's not just a trip that you take and you check it off the box. Hey, I've been to Belgium. This is actually, Johns Hopkins is one of the universities doing a lot of research into this. And the vast majority of people that go through a large dose psychedelic experience say it's the most important event of their lives. Not up there with the most more important than having kids, getting married, and those who don't say it's the most, it's in that next category. It's right there in the top 5 with death of a parent, marriage, kids. It's tremendously profound. And so then the question becomes, okay, now you've seen this and you felt love and you feel safety and you've had whatever opened to you. What are you going to do with that? How are you going to become the best possible you that, in your opinion, that you can be?
Yeah. What are you going to do with that experience?
What are you going to do?
Okay. Yeah. All right. I want to transition a little bit, because I've been peripherally aware, that there are people, and I think this probably started in Silicon Valley maybe, that are microdosing with hallucinogenics. So talk to us a little bit about what that means, what that is, and why somebody would consider microdosing.
So this is super interesting. Silicon Valley, there's actually a test with they gave, I think, 70 different people in Silicon Valley who had a problem that they could not solve for 3 months or more. They gave a higher dose psychedelic experience, and something like 2/3 or 3/4 of the problems got solved. So that led that engineering brain out there to say, well, wait a minute, if this is working in this thing, what if we just take a little bit every day or on some type of schedule? Will it make me more creative? And there's not a ton of definitive research, but whether it's for creativity or for connection, it does appear that microdosing works. There are two different ways to microdose. There's what's called the Ketamine protocol and the Stamets protocol. So with one, you take it on day one, you don't take it for 2 more days, and then you take it again. And you just follow that schedule, and every 30 days you take a 2-week break. And then the other protocol is you take it 3 or 4 days in a row, you take the next 3 days off, and you do that for a month and take a 2-week break. But it's a lot of anecdotal evidence that it is pretty valuable for creativity, connection, and it's sub-perceptual. So that's the other big thing. You can absolutely go work, you can drive a car, you can do all those types of things, or people do all those types of things while microdosing. Obviously, the risk is if you take more than you expected, it's
work could be
challenging. Yes, and you should not be driving a car.
But the idea is we're increasing creativity, connection, and like you said, it's just at that level below where we're aware that this is a psychoactive drug. We're not feeling high, certainly not hallucinating while we're at work. Now, you had mentioned this cycle where we're going to run either one of those protocols, right, and then a couple weeks off. Is that because we're going to build up a resistance to this over time, or is that more of a mental break? Where does the break come in?
The theory behind it is it's about building up resistance, so you don't want to have a tolerance. And you know what? Actually, I have a guide to microdosing, so let's do this. I'll put on my website at mattzemon.com/over50. I will put a link for a free download of that guide to microdosing, and it'll have the research, it'll have those two protocols, and any of your listeners can go there and download that for free.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll make sure I link up with that in the show notes as well. Okay, and I apologize. I meant to cover this while we were still talking about it, but let's step back a little bit. You had mentioned when you talked about, because ketamine seems to be the most accessible way for people to experience this today, and you said, well, there's several flavors of this, and that kind of surprised me, frankly. Talk to us about ketamine. Are there different types, different grades, different classes? Actually, sorry. Let's back up a little bit. What the heck is ketamine? Is it like LSD, where it's a chemical compound? Is it a plant-derived? What is ketamine?
Yep, it's a dissociative medicine that was originally created as an anesthesia. And at a sub-anesthetic dose, it creates this dissociative experience where you can kind of separate the you from the you and look back at different experiences and process in a way that is different than kind of in your ordinary life. It also, trying to think of how to say this here. It also gives it does neuroplasticity. So it's also building new connections in your brain and helping new neurons get created. And that is all helpful as well. And that keeps on going after the medicine has left your body. So that's also a powerful thing with ketamine.
And what is it derived from? Where does ketamine come from?
It's a synthetic, and I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. But what I do know is it targets the glutamate system, unlike most other, unlike any of the antidepressants that are out there. That's really focused more on serotonin.
Right, interesting. And I don't know if you're aware, but there's some new research coming up that's looking at the serotonin model of depression, and there's some findings there that may not be what we have thought it's been for quite some time. So it might be an exciting opportunity for ketamine and other substances. It's without
a doubt. I mean, there's people don't understand. The scientists don't know why antidepressants work on the people that they work on.
Right. Which is only a certain percentage, right?
Correct.
It's not
about
everybody.
60.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it takes a long time. And that's the other radical thing. When you're prescribed an antidepressant, it can take 6-8 weeks before it starts having an impact on your body. Ketamine is almost instantaneous. It's same day. Not let's see what happens here for weeks or months later.
Yeah, and you had mentioned earlier, I think, that it's like 2 sessions with ketamine can have life-altering permanent effects, as opposed to say an antidepressant, which you're on for long periods of time. It comes with a whole host of side effects. But going back to ketamine, you had mentioned several different types or flavors. Let's pick that apart a little bit.
So ketamine is ketamine. The difference is how is it going to get into your body. So option number 1 is what's called an intravenous injection, and that's where you work with typically a nurse anesthesiologist, and they hook you up to an IV, and they slowly drip it into your body for a period of time, typically about an hour. The second option would be an intramuscular, where they give you kind of a shot, and that's a much faster onset of what it feels like. The third would be an oral or sublingual, where you put a rapid dissolve tablet underneath your tongue and you let it dissolve, and you keep it in your mouth for, depending on the protocol that your doctor will prescribe, 10 to 15 minutes. And then you can spit that out and go on your journey. And then the fourth option would be intranasal, where you use a nasal spray and put it in your nose. Those are the four primary ways that ketamine is prescribed today.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So folks could be aware that they can choose their own, I guess, method of administration there. And as you were saying that, I was kind of thinking, I remember I took a class in college, I think it was shamanic anthropology or something like that. And I can remember them delivering hallucinogenics through this big blowpipe nasally to the shaman or to the recipients in that case. But so different ways to take ketamine. And what is, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but what is the future of say ketamine in particular, since that's the one that's legal and people have access to now? Is there a rise in the use and awareness of ketamine? Because it seems to me it's still kind of a fringy thing used in the ways we're talking about as this mental health therapy.
Sure. I mean, we've gone from, I think 6 years ago or 7 years ago, there were 50 ketamine clinics in America, and now there's like 700. So it is absolutely on the rise. I think the question that for us over 50 as we're thinking about ketamine is kind of which philosophy do you believe in? So there's one group of practitioners who say you just need the biochemical reaction. So go into your medical office, throw some IV, throw some medicine into you, and you see what happens. The next option would be Ketamine-Assisted Psychotherapy, which is more of a practice of we're going to give a true licensed therapist around this experience, and they're going to help you with before and after, and we're going to help with the medicine. And then the third is Ketamine-Assisted Therapy, which would be typically unlicensed, so working with a guide or a life coach or that type of specialist who's going to not prescribe the medicine, but again, help you prepare and unpack it. So in all the cases, there needs to be a person licensed in your state to prescribe it. The question is, do you feel you want a therapist along with you, a guide along with you, or just put the medicine in and see what the medicine does? Personally, in my experience, and what the research has shown is the best results come from those who combine some type of therapy, whether it's licensed or unlicensed, along with the psychedelic medicine, and in this case, ketamine.
Certainly that makes sense, and having a guide or a therapist sounds like that would be the way to go. And we had mentioned, we've talked about depression, anxiety. What other sorts of things might people go to this sort of a guided or therapeutic ketamine session for?
Yeah. So, I mean, the top options obviously are, like you said, depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, absolutely. Eating disorders, smoking. People want to stop smoking. There's a lot of results. Alcohol use, again, a lot of research coming out of the effectiveness of ketamine to rewire the brain in a way that alcohol use is stopped or certainly radically reduced. And then the other thing that's getting a lot of research lately is cluster headaches. So for people who have a history of migraines, ketamine is proven to be very effective, and other it's been used for pain for a lot of years, but headaches is getting a lot of attention of late.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard that one. I can certainly see how eating disorders, substance abuse disorders, any sort of dysfunction with relationship with self, which most of us carry around, right, in some way or other and to some degree of severity. But I can see how some sort of a psychedelic experience, especially if it's guided by a professional, would really help to mitigate that. And that's interesting that you had mentioned there the cluster headaches, migraine headaches, that there may be some application there as well.
Yeah, we get stuck in our ways of thinking, especially we get
Oh, we do.
in our 50s. We know it's like this is how we think. And kind of behind the curtain, our brain is firing the same kind of patterns over and over. What these dissociative experiences or psychedelic experiences do is it allows for that period of time your brain to fire in a whole different way. It's like laying a fresh coat of powder on a mountain. And when you emerge from it, you can now ski down that mountain on different tracks than you've ever skied before. And it's really beautiful what that can do. The other thing we didn't talk about just quickly is one thing that's a major difference in ketamine and these other psychedelics is a ketamine experience is typically an hour. That's it. So you're not committing to a 6 or 7 hour experience like psilocybin and ayahuasca. It's you can do this in the morning before work every couple weeks, and or on a Saturday morning and move on with your day.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, obviously, I have no experience with ketamine. With most of the other things we've mentioned today, I have a little bit of it, or in some cases, a lot of experience with. But that's very interesting. And I didn't realize that ketamine was full-on FDA approved, and I thought it was more of a fringe supplement type thing. But it's actually an approved drug, and you can go and have it prescribed. And obviously, our strong recommendation, I think, would be to work with a guide or a therapist as you do that. Now, you and I were kind of sharing off camera here before we were recording a little bit about our own experiences with this, but let's talk about this psychedelic therapy specifically for end of life and maybe even for families in end of life situations.
Yes, this is super important. I'm really glad you brought this up. So for people who have a terminal illness and have tried a number of other things, there's a right to try that allows them to use some different psychedelic drugs, and that's the experience that these people with terminal illnesses have in the clinical studies. It doesn't change the fact that they're going to die. What it does is it changes their experience for this time that they have. And it changes not only the way they internalize this experience, but it's how they interact with their family and others during this period as well. So whether it's under the right to try, or whether it's prescribed ketamine, or whether it's some other way that they have found their way to this medicine, the experiences can be quite incredible for those actually in the dying process. In addition to that, whether it's ketamine or a different psychedelic, with the family members of people who are in this process can help them come to terms with, wow, I'm about to lose, or someone I love very much is about to transition into a different existence than I would prefer. But this might give me a new way to think about that, to process it, and to connect with them. So it's very powerful. There's a lot of end-of-life doulas and hospice workers. There's studies on the effects of this in palliative care. What else with someone who has high anxiety and depression around dying can you give them and not have to wait months for it to take effect? It's so powerful for end of life.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. And you mentioned what else can we give people? And even if you're giving people some other substance, my guess is that what we're really doing is just kind of numbing at that point. We're not transforming that person, and certainly that whatever that pharmaceutical is that we give that person to help ease that anxiety of death isn't going to do anything for the rest of the family, right? In fact, it may make them more distraught as they see their loved one, not only now in the end stages of life, but maybe a little more comatose due to the whatever that drug is that they're giving them. So I love the idea of using this class of substances for end of life, and especially for the family, right? To come to terms with this. And you had mentioned a right to try. So does that mean that there's kind of this legal loophole for trying other substances other than ketamine in these extreme end-of-life situations?
There is. And if you Google right to try, you'll see a ton of information on how the programs work and what's out there. I want to go back, though, on one item. With people in end-of-life situations, the it's important that they are working with their doctors, because typically there's other medications, there's things that could interact, and just you certainly don't want to make things worse for that person. So depending on what is happening and what is causing the end of life, will also maybe determine what medicine that you can or cannot um, take. There are also organizations out there that will, again, they're not recommending that people do anything, but they will give you the information on what contraindications might be there. So someone who is interested, for example, in I'm taking X, Y, and Z medicine, my grandson has gotten some psilocybin, can I take this? They might want to go to, like, the Spirit Pharmacist is an example of one that's out there that provides just that kind of consultation and information. This is a PsyD, or a guy who has a doctorate in pharmacology, and they can provide that information in a again, safe and confidential way. But again, it's super important that they work with their doctors.
Got it. Okay, thanks. So, folks out there, a couple of resources and just some things to think about, right? And in our age bracket, we all have aging parents if our parents are still with us, and it's a reality for us as well as we age. But Matt, I want to switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about the use of psychedelics in just this age and this time. We live in an unprecedented time of this massive cultural divide, and it just seems to be getting worse, right? It's more and more of the us and them. Well, I'm right, and that means that the other side is wrong. And we now have these weird communication things where our walls immediately go up when we hear something we disagree with. And we're not only just putting ourselves in a us and them camp, but we're often labeling ourselves as righteous and good, and people who think the other way as evil or bad. And that's not a good trend for mankind, period. I don't care what kind of spin you put on that. How might psychedelic medicine help in this sort of a regard?
So what's beautiful about psychedelic medicines, first, that it's supported on both sides of the aisle. There are Republicans and Democrats. It's hard to who are funding this and who are supporting it politically. It's when you're seeing what this does for veterans and victims of sexual assault. This is a both party issue. And that's nice. It's nice for it to be on that side. On the cultural divide, it's actually interesting. We look back in 1970 and that all the things that were happening around the Controlled Substance Act, it was people saying, like, tune in and drop out and get out of the normal society, and that type of frenzy around that led to the backlash. When I think about what psychedelics can do for the cultural divide, it can make people feel connected, that we're not individuals in our nuclear families, that we are connected in some way to everybody, that we are all brothers and sisters in some respects. And with a mind-opening experience like that and a heart-opening experience like that, it may slow us down to say, well, maybe I should take a moment to listen to what this other person says and try to understand their perspective, or maybe to rephrase mine in a way that I can meet them where they're at, and not be angry, but engage in just a loving discourse about our perspectives. And I think psychedelics can. It's not like you've gone to school and you've learned something. You have felt something truly in your bones and in your heart, and you can bring that into your very next conversation.
Yeah, I love the way that you put that, kind of that heart opening and that substantial shift in consciousness, realizing that we're not just individuals, or it's not really us and them, it's all of us, and there is this connectedness to life that you can't, I suppose you really can't learn academically or rationally. You really need to feel that profoundly to understand it on that really deep level. And I do agree. I think that would go a long ways towards kind of helping to bring us, maybe just dial some of this rhetoric down a little bit and allow us to have this loving discourse with one another, as opposed to this more hateful, polarized conversations we seem to be happening. Well, now, as we are wrapping up here, what's next for you personally? You've got this book out now. What's the future hold for you?
So the book is coming out, or I guess the book's out now, which is exciting. I'm so used to saying it that way. Uh, and there's a lot of spreading the information that's in this book. Happy is launching here in Florida and then expanding out across the country. So here this is actually another way to get ketamine is through telehealth. So you have a prescriber send you the medicine at home, and then you have a peer support person in your home with you as you take it. And that's a very unobtrusive way to experience ketamine as well. And it also brings the cost way down because it's basically a do-it-yourself with the support of the guides and the organization and the digital therapeutics, as you talked about. And there's a number of companies like Happy that are doing this with a lot of success. Actually, a study just came out with, I think, 1,200 patients, and almost 90% of them had a reduction in depression and anxiety after their ketamine sessions.
Wow. And if I'm not mistaken, that's HAPPYY. Is that right?
Yep. Just happy with two Y's.
Happy with two Y's. Yeah. And so if I understand you correctly, then that's a telemedicine platform that will be you're heading that up. Is that right?
It is. Yeah. That's
Fantastic.
I'm the CEO of that company and co-founder, and
Right.
Wolf is my partner in that. And he and I are bringing that across the country.
Fantastic. So we've talked a lot about ketamine and how you might engage with that or find that, use that, and that would be a great way. Now, when will that platform be up and fully available for folks to go on and schedule consultations and maybe order ketamine?
Yep. It is up for Florida as of early
right.
October. And then as quickly as we can bring on the network in other states, we will move across. But we expect to be in a number of states by the end of 2023.
Gotcha. And so is this a regulatory issue that you got, because you're mentioning state by state? Is that what's happening there?
So we're really a technology platform connecting people who are interested with prescribers, and what we have to do is build that network on a state by state so that every state has licensed practitioners in their state.
Right. Okay. That's what I was getting at. So it is a license by state sort of thing, and you guys are, like you said, you're this more of a technology platform connecting these folks. All right, so folks can find more information there. And Matt, how can people connect with you? You had mentioned your website. Are you active on social media?
Yeah, so mattzemon.com is the website. mattzemon.com/over50. We'll put that free microdosing guide there for your listeners. And then LinkedIn and Instagram are probably the best other places to find me.
Okay, thanks. And I'll make sure I put all of that in the show notes as well. And folks, that's mattzemon.com, MATTZEMON. That book is Psychedelics for Everyone, and that's available now. I strongly recommend you guys reach out to Matt and engage with him. Check out that book. Matt, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing all your wisdom and your knowledge and your passion with us. And I wish you all the best in all your future endeavors.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me on today.
You bet.